and welcome to the latest episode of the Dialogue Out Loud series. I'm Taylor Petrey, editor of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. We've got a really special episode today. We're going to be discussing the latest in a series of high-quality film and television productions featuring Latter-day Saints called American Primeval. This 19th century Western drama follows several characters, both real and fictional, in the Utah territories of the 1850s, in what would become Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Colorado. In these stories, early Latter-day Saints, including Brigham Young, as well as Native American tribes like the Shoshone, Paiute, and Ute, the U.S. Army, and trappers and frontiersmen like Jim Bridger are really big characters here. I'm excited to welcome our distinguished panelists to talk about this show. Here we've got with us today Angelo Baca, Diné Hopi, who is an assistant professor of at the Rhode Island School of Design in History, Philosophy, and Social Sciences, with a focus on Indigenous and Native American studies. As a filmmaker, scholar, and activist, his work encompasses sacred lands protection, repatriation, and food sovereignty. Benjamin E. Park teaches American history at Sam Houston State University. He is the author or editor of 5 books, including Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire, which won the Mormon History Association's Best Book Prize, and American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, which was listed as a Best Book of 2024 by The New Yorker. You can follow his new YouTube channel at Professor Benjamin Park. Lindsay Hansen Park, no relation to Ben, is a writer, storyteller, historian, and activist known for her groundbreaking work at the intersection of Mormon history, feminism, and social justice. She's the executive director of the Sunstone Education Foundation and is best known for her acclaimed podcast, Year of Polygamy, which has reshaped public understanding of Mormon polygamy through rigorous research and compelling storytelling. Park has served as a historical consultant for FX's Under the Banner of Heaven and Netflix's American Primeval. And she's a consulting producer for ABC's Daughters of the getting all these words mixed up. Daughters of the Cult. Thank you. All right. Welcome to you all. I couldn't be more excited about having you all with us today. Let's go ahead and get just general reactions here quickly. Things that you liked, things that you hated. We're going to get into a lot of specifics, but did you all like this show? And I know we've got Lindsay here as somebody who is a producer, a consultant on it, but we're going to give our unvarnished opinions about it. Angelo, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. And as a filmmaker and a scholar in this area with Indigenous film productions and stereotypes and tropes, doing that anti-stereotype work. It's not great in that area, but I do give it marks for bringing up some little known kind of historical figures, locations, cultural representations, different types of I think stuff that you don't see in mainstream Hollywood productions on a massive production scale. And so I thought it was really interesting the way that it was playing with all of those elements, especially when it comes into the territory of historical revisionist fictions. There are plenty of other opportunities to look at films that are like that. And so if anything, what they do is they beg you to ask more questions about research, and that's the basis of research, is asking more questions. So I think that's really good for the general public to say, did that really happen? Is that really accurate? Let me go find out.
Fascinating. Ben, how about you?
Sure. I enjoyed much of the series. I thought it was a very gripping tale. I mean, the showrunners are experts at the craft. I thought the historical liberties that they took were done to tell a particular story, and that story was very movingly told. And so with their aim of what they said to do, I thought they accomplished it quite well. I came away from the series entertained, connected to some characters, while also, wanting to dissect other things like all over-specialized history nerds do when they watched historical stories. But in general, I thought it was a series worth engaging, and I'm sure we're going to be engaging it quite a bit here.
And Lindsay, you worked on the show a little bit. Tell us a little bit about that process and then how you felt about the final product.
Okay, well, first of all, no obligation for anyone, especially on the panel, to like this or to say nice things about it. I'm very familiar with the Mormon studies perspective on shows like this, and this show in particular, and was aware of that in the process working on it, going in and doing several of these now. Uh, I'm very aware of sort of the conflicts and how things are going to be portrayed. And so for this show in particular, it was interesting because it was such a different experience than other shows I'd worked on. They prioritize, in this case, consultants like the Indigenous consultant, and we can talk about how she did in her role there. But my role was pretty small. I was there working with a production team mostly to build the look and feel of it. So I'm really proud of that work. I got to build the Nauvoo Legion. That was really fun. I think we spent a whole week trying to determine the flag that would have been up in Echo Canyon, if there would have been a flag, what it looked like. There's a historical debate and some mystery surrounding those things. And so it's interesting to have, work on a film like this where we go into such extensive detail for like a flag that you're going to see for a second versus historical plot lines that don't follow the choreography of the history. So we can talk about that as well. But overall, I really enjoyed the show. Mark L. Smith's writing is really compelling to me. I thought The Revenant was brilliant. I'm really interested in Angelo's perspective of revisionist history, and if that applies to that show too, because I do think that there is a romanticization that happens in the West. But for my sake, I'm probably a lone ranger in the fact that I think that this was good for Mormonism to be portrayed in a Western in this light. I'm really excited about it. I'm excited for what it means for future Mormon depictions in film, especially in the Western genre. So we can talk about all of that.
Yeah, in many ways, this was really an homage to other westerns as film, picking up some of the kind of main plots and characters and so on. And of course, one of the staples of that genre is the depiction of Native Americans. And I'm interested, Angelo, if you want to talk a little bit more about this, about how you felt like the Shoshone and the Utes and the Paiutes are depicted here. Some of the characters that they kind of use to tell those stories, as well as what it sort of gets right about the history and what it gets wrong, and just kind of, tell us a little bit about your perspective on this.
Yeah, so I'm Navajo and Hopi, and so I don't represent any of those tribes that are being portrayed in the Netflix series. But I know Forrest Kutch just wrote a Salt Lake City Tribune op-ed stating his position pretty clearly, that he thinks that the stereotypes are harmful and they're not doing any really good understanding or work to kind of unfold the accuracy of the American West or those tribes. And, he literally wrote the book for Utah tribes and was the former director for the Division of Utah Affairs. And so his opinion and his research is pretty much the gold standard for a lot of us. And so in that way, I feel like he is hitting the nail right on the head, where it's not accurate. It's not actual material to educate or contribute to a better understanding of what really happened back then. But I think in the way that it does shed light on little known histories around the state for massacres is an interesting way to kind of put that in the limelight. So thinking about, the Utah War, the Black Hawk War, Mountain Meadows Massacre, Chief Posey's War, Bear River Massacre. Like, there are so many different historical events that are not being talked about or being taught in school, especially in Utah. And so I'm part of this project in San Juan County called the 100 Years of Silence. And we're talking about the so-called Chief Posey's War, or the last Indian War in the United States. And it wasn't a war, wasn't a massacre. Usually if it's a massacre, it's deemed that because two or more white folks got killed. And so suddenly it's like a massacre of some kind. So, I find it interesting when we're talking about these stories because the historical accounts are themselves, many of them, also just fiction. They're historical fiction in the historical record. They're not really accurate either. And they only get one portrayal of one side, who are the settler colonial folks coming into an indigenous territory. So that's part of the work that we're doing with the community, getting all the perspectives from the elders, the leaders, the people who remember that time and, you know, feel that other side of history in, so that people get a better understanding of what actually happened then.
This is so interesting and so important because I really resonate with what you said. Like, we didn't learn about that stuff growing up in Utah. I really, it's been in my adult years that I came to learn some of the history here. And so on the one hand, the story in American Primeval points us to that, suggests that these kinds of things were happening in these years. And at the same time, really is drawing on, as you said, a lot of stereotypes as well. Thanks for pointing us to that other editorial. We'll make sure to get that in our show notes for people to check it out here. But what are some of those stereotypes that are sort of the most kind of contentious here?
Well, I think there's a lot of mixing up of the places and the people. Again, the historical fictionized world, that it's a lot of crossing over of things. I mean, it makes me think of like Tarantino films, you know, like like Django Unchained, or you know, Inglourious Bastards, or you know, even Yellowstone is itself a kind of like modern revisionist Western, where we know that it's ridiculous to the 11th degree. It's turned all the way up. And it's like, that's not how people's actual lives here in the West, but it's nice to, like, you know, be dramatic about it and kind of tell these little known stories. So I think, you know, besides the ability to have, you know, Native actors, Native culture portrayed, it brings up also some other kind of interesting little tidbits. There's already the narrative of, you know, settlers dressing up as Indians and causing trouble. The Boston Tea Party, for example, that's one of the very first early ones, right? Trying to blame it on Indians because, you know, white folks were dressed up as natives. And, you know, the Shoshone say, like, not, you know, that wasn't us. People are or dressed up as them. And there's also the whole narrative about the kidnapping of the women. And these kidnap narratives are tale as old as time, man. 1700s, 1600s, soon as settlement happened. James Fenimore Cooper, Last of the Mohicans. Like, there's a ton of all of these narratives of like, oh, this is bad. They'll kidnap you. They'll do this and that to you. And the majority of those historical accounts, if you look into them, actually those who were taken out of necessity. And then when they wanted to have the choice to be coming back to their own cultural side, they chose not to. They didn't want to, because they're like, I like the way that we live here. We actually have say, especially the women.
Thank you so much. I think you're right to point to both, as what Lindsay said, the sort of romanticization of the West, as well as the kind of overproduction of the violence in some respects there too. It's a really important point, and thanks for pointing us to some of those themes that kind of show up in the way that Native Americans are depicted so frequently. Lindsay, why don't we turn to you to get some comments on how the show represents Latter-day Saints, what it gets right and wrong here, what are the stereotypes that it is using in order to tell this story, and yeah, just sort of general reactions along those lines.
Yeah, of course. I think that in some ways, all Westerns in film are revisionist history, right? It's relying on tropes and archetypes and stereotypes that exist within the Western genre. And so from a creative standpoint, seeing that in the film, you can see how the same thing that they did with the Indigenous tribes here, sort of make a composite of them and taking these captivity narratives and you know, infusing them into the story and the story of Olive Oatman and all of these things. The creators also did with the Mormon characters. And I think in a way that frustrated Mormons and made Mormons, Latter-day Saints in particular, really offended. I mean, they felt like they were picked on because it showed Brigham Young and the Nauvoo Legion. as sort of the villains in this story. And we can go into that later because I really like to defend that choice. But I think that it's important to note for Latter-day Saints that there is a little bit of a spectrum in this show about Latter-day Saint portrayal. We have Latter-day Saint characters who are sort of the victims and the heroes in this narrative, and then we have the bad guys. I think the most of the focus has been on Brigham Young, and I understand why, but there were composites that I think that people don't understand. And when you're writing a script, you are looking for those archetypes, you are looking for those characters. And I know from talking to Peter Berg and just all the history that he's talked about and read in the show, he was really interested in infusing this story with a lot of those stories from the West. And so you'll see that. I mean, even the Fort Bridger becomes a composite of Fort Limhi and Fort Bridger, right? We don't have Brigham Young riding to Fort Bridger, but he did visit Fort Limhi. And some of the events that happen at Limhi get put at Bridger. We have the Woolsey character, James Woolsey, is inspired by John D. Lee. We have the Abish character, who's Olive Oatman, Anna Morgan, Rachel Plummer, all these captivity narratives. And so you see that the Shoshone warrior Red Feather was a composite of Chief Numaga and the Paiute Indian War of 1860. And Winterbird, I think she was pattern after the two-spirit Indigenous chief Pine Leaf, who fought for the Crow in the early 19th century. And so he's pulling from archetypes all over Western history and putting them in this narrative. And I think Latter-day Saints didn't like that. I think that they wanted like a pure sort of, this is how we see Brigham Young, this is how we see our ancestors. And it wasn't that.
I want to put the two, Lindsay and Angelo, I want to put the two of you in conversation because this is one of the interesting things about the show, that the Mormons are not uniformly good or uniformly bad. And we have multiple representations of Native Americans as well here, of some are good and some are bad. And how does that sort of complicate the storylines, I guess, a little bit in trying to represent that diversity? Does it succeed or does it fail, I guess, here?
Well, I think one of the really interesting things while Lindsay was talking, it reminded me also of the Days of 47. Like, that's a revisionist Mormon history that happens every July in Salt Lake. So, they like to tell their own stories of how they got here and what they did and how things were and what it was like. And there's that dangerous trap of nostalgia, that somehow it was better back then than now, when arguably, things haven't changed that much. We're only talking 100, 150 years or so, whatever. I mean, only thing that's changed is technology, accessibility, and resources. And a lot of those attitudes haven't changed. There's still a lot of these historical wounds that are still open and festering and need addressing. And so I think about that also when we, as Native people in Utah, are still competing with other Mormon groups to acknowledge our own cultural history in our own sacred spaces. Well, they have their little hand carts and do their portrayals again of like a different kind of history in a different place. And it's like, you guys are sort of missing the point if you're really bent on accuracy. And so, I think about that in terms of what does that mean in terms of what kind of stuff do you want to show that, makes you want to be proud to represent that. I mean, for me, what I wish didn't get represented in the Netflix series, I wanted so bad Porter Rockwell to be in there because he was the right-hand man for Brigham Young. Like, talk about a hitman and a killer. Like, let's talk about that evil, because that was interesting. And if anyone had the guts to portray that, I was like, come on, Netflix, do it. But it didn't happen.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I felt the same way. And I got to tell you that when I read the script, Bill Hickman read so different than the actor. So I was kind of shocked and like, that's not who I pictured. That's not the guy. I struggled with similar things. And to the Latter-day Saint audience I feel like there is a better response than there was on other Mormon film. I think we're maturing in that area. But I also think that there's this defensiveness of, persecution. The Mormons feel like they've been persecuted. Like I said, I was excited to see Mormons painted in this role as sort of a villain of the West. I think that in many ways from every perspective outside of the Mormon and maybe Thomas Caine's perspective, they were viewed that way. And fairly or unfairly so is absolutely up to debate. And it's something that we do in Mormon studies a lot. But I do think that from the perspective of invader, I mean, that's who my ancestors were. We came and colonized this land and displaced a lot of people through violence and through the worst of it, which was starvation, disrupting the ecology and changing the landscape. And as Angelo has said, there's not a lot of discussion about that. And Angelo, your work had brought me to the idea years ago, and I can't remember how you phrased it, but the idea that the term Indian, the way that it's used in Mormon studies, is used to erase the Indigenous band identity. And so it is disappointing when it's done in film. I will say, though, there's, I guess you could call it, I don't know if you could call it equity, but there's some equity in the fact that all the groups got sort of that treatment, right? Everyone was desperate. Everybody was at the edge of their rage. They were all acting from scarcity. They were all defensive, and they all come together in this series. And they're all composites of sort of all of these different parts of the history to make this whole. And I'm just wondering, Angelo, if you felt like that the Mormon depiction of evil was fair or overdone, or what you thought about that.
Well, if I am correct in my understanding, I believe they lifted most, if not all, of Brigham Young's journal accounts to be part of the script, right? So, I mean, it's like, it's all right there, guys. You know, like you can portray that any way that you want to, but the words are the same. So to me, it's like, if you think that's evil, then why do you think that's evil? You know, because a lot of Mormons will think that as good and that they're in the right, and that historically speaking, you know, establishing their Zion was going to take bloodshed anyway. And, you know, we're still in that moment right now where we're talking about establishing a Zion. Is it worth genocide? It's a good question, because it doesn't just happen here in Utah. It happens everywhere.
Before I would go to Ben, let me ask one question of the two of you too. There is I couldn't quite tell if it was supposed to be the Mountain Meadows Massacre or something like the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but there is a representation, and Lindsay, you might be able to speak more directly to like what specific event it was talking about. But tell us a little bit about that depiction, both from the sort of Mormon and Native American involvement perspective.
Yeah, I can go first on that. So the inciting event in this, and you know, when you have a good story, you have the inciting event, the thing that sets it all off, right? Is they use the Mountain Meadows Massacre. They barely used the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I mean, it's a massacre, and you know, the choreography of the massacre is not accurate at all, right? You know, if you know the history of the massacre, it takes place over days, months even, and there are all these things that happen. And in the film, it's like 2 minutes, right? And it's just like a bunch of arrows and a bunch of guns and a bunch of people that weren't there, and people survived that didn't survive. It's just a massacre. And what I would try to tell viewers who are really precious about that is, outside of Utah, most of people don't know where Utah is on a map. And the fact that there was this massacre, they're not going to really care about who lined up who talked to who did what. They get what they need from that scene, which is that a lot of people died and it was blamed on, you know, the Native Americans or whatever. But yeah, as far as the historicity of that massacre goes, no. I mean, you had people joining the party, the fanfare party that was coming down, that was depicted as being massacred in the series. And people did join up with that, but the people that survived were children, most of them under the age of 8, and you didn't like get away from that. And the timeline, of course, in that is really truncated. It makes Cedar City look like it's right next to Wyoming. And so there was a lot of stuff wrong with, I would say, the chronology of the history. But the overall thrust of it was there's a massacre by Mormon men who covered their faces and tried to blame local bands of Paiutes, and it made the government mad. So
Anything to add, Angelo?
Oh, I just like that historically it really added some flair, some dramatic flair on the complicated relationship between Mormons and the federal government. and that's transferred all the way into today with public lands and national monuments and, cattle grazing and whatever, what have you. It's still like this friction that has existed all the way from the time that before it was even a state, so I kind of think that's really helpful for people to understand, like, why is this such a weird, difficult relationship, not just in Utah, but places like Oregon or Idaho and, where other Mormon communities are also experiencing friction with federal authorities. I think that's probably one of the nice finer things that have been left out in a majority of other revisionist Westerns or even stories about Mormons.
Yeah, great point. Ben, that takes us to you here, and sorry for the long delay, but I wonder if you could comment. You'll have lots of thoughts on these other points as well, but if you can comment a little bit on the representation of some of the other characters, the Army, Jim Bridger, some of these other folks, how they're used here as both characters, and give us a little bit of the historical background here too.
Yeah, great questions. And I'm really glad to hear all these wonderful points from both Angelo and Lindsay so far. I think to tie together what they've been saying into your question, Taylor, I think that starting off the series with the Mountain Meadows Massacre, or this depiction of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, actually did more than just springing the narrative into action. It also set the stakes of the story. And in one ways, because, as Lindsay said, it does not attempt to try to be historically accurate. They had access to the best historians of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, including Lindsay, including Rick Turley. It was a choice they did to present the massacre that way. And I think in a way that was sending a message of saying that they are using history to tell a story rather than trying to literally recreate history, right? This is often a divide between us history nerds who try to recreate the past with neutrality and storytellers who are more interested in telling a thematically true story than a literally true story. And so I don't think we need to hold these filmmakers to try to make sure that it is a pure fidelity to the historical facts. So I think you see this play out in how these major historical characters are depicted. Bill Hickman, which Lindsay already mentioned before, how he doesn't match how you might find in the on the page, that stood out to me too. That's not the Bill Hickman I had in my mind. In my mind, Bill Hickman is a lot more like how Jim Bridger is depicted in the series, but Bill Hickman plays the role of the cleric, right? A very standard stereotype in these stories. The button-up guy who looks like he's, always coming from a church service meeting, but is willing to do dirty work on the side. Brigham Young is playing this historical role as the zealot leader, and I think it fits into this longer tradition of whenever you get these literary depictions of Mormons, there's almost this pyramid factor going on to where the lower common saints always get more dimensions as characters, and the higher you get up on this hierarchical chart, by the time you get to Brigham Young, it's often more of a one-dimensional character, and I think that's true here as well. Jim Bridger is the comic relief in this story, right? He's the of all the characters, he, along with maybe a handful other, are the ones that people are going to sympathize with. But to be able to get these characters in place, it's clear that the showrunners had to condense the geographic space, move around the chronology, moving around, right? Fort Bridger, that transfers hands years before the Utah War, but that's not as interesting for the story, right? These showrunners, these creators, they're trying to tell the story of competitions over sovereignty in the West. And they have a clear thesis in how they're trying to present this. It's an idea that out in the West, people were stripped down to their primeval passions and aggressions. And here we have people expressing that base reality of humanity. So yes, we see a lot of depravity in Indigenous people, but we see a lot of depravity in the Mormons. We see a lot of depravity in the traders who are out there. Everyone is stripped out. And this is actually where I go, and I'm sorry for rambling on, but this is where I think is a fascinating element that we find in the story, to where while it's challenging a lot of long-held traditions of how we view the West, there is one element that still shines through that's an unfortunate media idea, but has been destroyed in scholarship, which is the idea of the U.S. Army as a civilizing force, right? If we're looking for anyone who is bringing order to these merciless savages and these zealous Mormons, it's these soldiers who are coming out and bringing statehood. They're bringing swords. They're bringing the guns, and I mean, it's the general who's the only one who has a clear-eyed view of what's going on. And I think never is this juxtaposition more clear than in the fact that in this story, it's the Mormons who slaughtered the Shoshone in a big massacre, when in reality, it was the militia. It was federal troops who slaughtered the Shoshone at the Bear River Massacre. And so I think that's one element that surprised me, that on the one hand, this show tries to show a diversity of experiences, including among Indigenous, but it's still, trapped in this romantic sense of this untamed Wild West that can only be civilized through the westward march of the federal government.
That is a little bit of a strange element of this story, and it's one of the things I'm really glad that you brought up, is the sort of redeeming of the U.S. Army and all of this. Lindsay, Angelo, any reactions to that point?
I didn't see it as redeeming at all. I thought it was just what it had always been in the history of the West, was a complete failure on all parts, right? Because, I mean, I think there's many examples that you could point to for, not just like settlers and colonial forces, but just trying to retake certain territories that didn't belong to them. I mean, think about all of the forces lost from the United States military just by Geronimo and his handful of warriors, and that war lasted for years, and they had easily just a modest amount of warriors to hold them back in that entire territory in Arizona. So to me, it's like it's more of, again, filling in the blanks for not just the people who are watching, but also thinking about in their own backyard here in Utah. It's like, why is that relationship complicated with the United States government? And, to the larger point, when we're looking at this like revisionist history, I think it also should kind of like shake something loose in terms of what people like to watch in terms of revisionist history, and where do they draw the line? If you like Forrest Gump, that was not historically accurate at all, but it was sure entertaining to see him, run his way through 3 decades of historical American history change. Like, so is that where you draw the line? Is like right here now? Like, so that part interests me more as audience member.
Yeah, the Shoshone massacre by Mormons was interesting for me, because I know that there's an argument to be made that, just a couple years before the Utah War, Mormons, along with federal help and supplements, went and massacred 100 Timpanogos, Utes, and Shoshone. So, it's certainly, the Mormons' hands weren't clean when it came to this, but I did think that was interesting. I like what you said, Ben, about this sort of hero narrative that we still ascribe to the government that came in during that time. As we know on the historical record, it's a lot messier. The government barely had an army, right? This is right before the Civil War. They were coming out of the Revolutionary War. They're a young country. They don't know what they're doing. And often in the West, especially during this time, the U.S. government would send their bad guys, the guys that failed at other jobs, to the West. They would be the Indian agents. They would be the guys who got busted for doing immoral stuff. They would often be sent to the West. And those were the guys running the government business. So oftentimes they were bad actors and they weren't very organized. And I really think it would have been interesting to see the relationship with the government and the Mormons played out a little bit differently, because Mormons today, as Angelo says, there is still a tension between Mormons and the federal government. That a lot of U.S. militias are seated with Mormons and Mormon ideas. And I don't think people realize how much of a play that Mormon doctrine has fed into militias all around the country. And that still exists today. And it existed back then. And so the relationship between the government and the Mormons, in some ways, is more complicated than Mormons' relationship with anything else. And yet those who revere Brigham Young, or even in Mormon studies, there's this tendency to say, well, Mormons were doing that with everyone. They were negotiating with Wakara and indigenous leaders in the same way that they were negotiating with the government. And I just don't think that that's fair. I think the Mormons were strategically organizing to their advantage at all times, and they didn't care who it was with. But this portrayal of Brigham Young as sort of a gangster of the West, I think it's historically defensible. And I know that that places me in sort of a bad position in some folks in Mormon studies, but when you have a man that's controlling the trade routes, the water, the encroachment of any outsider, including insiders that they invaded, they have spies, they're taking over the mail, they're negotiating with the government. They've got spies in the government. They're dealing with money and trade and alcohol. What would you call that? Like, to me, that's pretty gangster. And that's how the West was being run. And Brigham Young was right at the top of it.
I want to come back to this question of the representation of Mormonism, but let me, before we lose Angelo in a few minutes here, let me come to a question that Ben had raised about what this show says about America. And Ben, you had sort of alluded to the title of American Primeval. It's sort of setting us in this primitive era here. And I think that the way you described it as a competition among sovereignty, among various groups. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you think this is saying about America itself? And Lindsay and Angela, if you have any comments on that point too.
Yeah, I think it's often, it fits into this general narrative now of America trying to get back to its unsavory roots, that the nation prides itself on its civilization, its progress, its enlightenment. But I think this story, as well as, previous similar works like The Revenant, try to show that America is built on the bodies of conflict out in the frontier, out in the West. And so that we shouldn't think too highly of ourselves. We should only focus on our patriotic education, to use the White House's new phrase, but instead that it's not too far in our near past that we were acting as what we might call brutes.
Yeah, and I like what Lindsay was saying about the Bear River Massacre, that clearly a lot of that action that happened there on the river was, kind of led by the U.S. military forces, but it wasn't without the help and the support and aid of Mormons, right? And, if you look at the history of the state, there is a campaign by the Mormons to try to control them as much as possible. Brigham Young thought it'd be easier to feed them than to fight them. And even in doing that, they would do it with, poison flour, which was like a common way to really take down indigenous populations. And even here, when we're talking about the so-called Posey War, after that single incident with just a handful of Ute folks, all the women and children were incarcerated in the middle of the town and held there for 5 months or 5 weeks. And so, the anniversary of that just happened like a couple days ago on the 19th of March. So that was in 1923. And just to think about having basically what is amounted to a concentration camp in the middle of town, and even this town won't acknowledge it. This county won't acknowledge it. Like, these are the harsh histories that actually happened that are accurate and horrifying, but it's easier for them somehow to consume something like this than it is their own terrible history. So I think it's, it's just coming back to the main point when we're talking about America, that nobody's hands are clean from this. And I think it's time for them to kind of like understand, like, so where are they going to position themselves when it does come to historical accuracy? Yeah, I'm more interested in answering those questions, as hard as they may be, because, we're all here together. No one's going anywhere. These are the lands that, our children and their children are, making families with. So I think the only way forward is to go back, figure out some way to have like reconciliation and healing, and move ahead from there.
I appreciate that. And I've said elsewhere, and I believe this to be true, that the Latter-day Saint response to this, to the show like this, is a little bit persecuted, and they're like, why are you showing Mormons as angry and violent and persecuted and unreasonable and paranoid? And then they respond with anger and paranoia and persecution. I think, like Angelo says, this is an opportunity. This is why I'm excited to have Mormons incorporated in the Western genre at all is progress for me, because Mormons were such a huge part of the settlement of the West for better, but also a lot for worse. And we're hardly ever mentioned. I grew up on Westerns my whole life, and you don't have Mormon characters unless they're sort of coded Mormon. Every once in a while there's a pioneer with 2 wives or something. But that's exciting to me. But when the LDS response is so knee-jerk and sort of territorial and persecuted, that's disappointing for me. I think I've noticed in my role in film, we can give the actors, we can give the directors the best histories, and we do. That's part of my job as being a responsible consultant, is making sure they have access to multiple histories, the most up-to-date histories. But they're still going to make choices of filmmakers. And it's not really up to Peter Berg to redeem the Mormon name, right? That's not what he's interested in. He didn't cause the Mormon problem. He's just telling a portrayal, a perspective that he sees. It's up to our communities to be responsible. And so when we have these opportunities, we can fall back into the old patterns of like, how dare they treat us this way? We're being misrepresented. Or we could gain some trust of outsiders and be like, you know what? Brigham Young actually did do that. And the Nauvoo Legion did do that. There's a lot of stuff, the church came out with a statement calling Brigham Young a beloved pioneer. And I just thought that was such a missed opportunity. They could have said, we see him as a man of virtue, but, clearly the historical record shows that he wasn't. I mean, Brigham Young's racism alone is indefensible to me, but when you position him in history, it gives a little bit more context to that. And those aren't the discussions people are having, but we should be having. People would trust us more if we responded to these things and said, yeah, let me reflect on that. What is it like to be a villain in the story and not the hero every time? What does that mean for me and my community? And I think those questions are healthy questions that every community should ask themselves, especially the Mormon community. But we're just unable to do that right now. We're kind of stuck in the persecuted phase of representation. And I think people will trust us more if we're able to hold some more nuance. And I know people think the show didn't have nuance, but again, I don't think that those main characters, any of them were as nuanced as anyone would like.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And Angelo, I know that you need to hop off. You had mentioned that you have a prior appointment that you need to leave. If you have a final comment, please make it now. But if not, we'll thank you for your time and for your expertise. It's really appreciated.
Yeah, well, thank you for such a great, lively discussion. I think it's important to bring in a lot of perspectives on this. And one thing that I also thought was really interesting was their use of the New Mexico landscape. It would have been great just to even have it actually in Utah, and there's beautiful landscapes here as well. But this also kind of folds back to the whole history of Westerns in general. Once it was said that the qualifying attributes to make it a Western are both the American landscape, because no one has anything like as beautiful, as big and bold and deserty as the West, and Indians, because no one else has that in the rest of the world. So everyone else is fascinated by it. So, European Americans are like, oh my gosh, like Indians, it's so like, how cool is that? It's like really interesting two traits there that distinguish it and make this already automatically in that category. So the landscape is a character. The landscape also has stories. The landscape also has agency, personality, power. It has history before people came here and then called it history, right? So we were here for thousands of years, and that's also kind of missing out of that major narrative that I thought was a missed opportunity. But, New Mexico is beautiful too. Love that spot as well. It is still part of the West, but I wish, so much more of the story could have been represented here in Utah. But thank you guys for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Angelo.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Ben, let me have you pick up a little bit on what Lindsay said last here too, and if there are other comments about Angelo's comments as well. But tell us a little bit about how Latter-day Saints reacted to it, why Brigham Young was such a polarizing figure in it, and your assessment of what that says.
Yeah, I think it shows that on the one hand, the LDS Church has become a bit more used to these types of depictions. We've had a number of media performances over the last few years that highlight, let's call them unsavory aspects of the LDS past. The LDS Church's general knee-jerk reaction is to cry persecution. That's baked in our history. We're never going to get rid of that. But I do think, as Lindsay mentioned earlier, we do see at least a little bit letting up on that, except in one avenue, and that's Brigham Young. And I think, as Lindsay mentioned, that because Brigham Young is not just a historical figure, and not just a beloved historical figure as a pioneer, a leader, but a prophet, right? Having that prophet hat on means that he needs to be seen a certain way within the Latter-day Saint community. And when they see the Brigham Young depicted in these shows, they're not comparing that Brigham Young to the historical Brigham Young, and Lindsay and I can go the rounds talking about the historical Brigham Young. They're comparing this TV show Brigham Young to their pioneer myth, the prophetic myth Brigham Young, which if there's some distance between the historical Brigham Young and the American Primeval Brigham Young, there is chasms of difference between the cartoonishly prophetic Brigham Young in a lot of LDS curriculum and this one. So it's often just a knee-jerk reaction of that's not the Brigham Young I know and recognize. This is a deep attack on my beloved prophet who fits into our priesthood line of authority and revelatory hierarchy of the church. So, which is why it's not just an attack on history, it's an attack on my faith.
Do you want me to respond to that?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I like that you said the prophet aspect, because this is what I wish Latter-day Saints would recognize, because even me, who has been very critical of Brigham Young, I still fall into my old Mormon neural pathways, right? I mean, I remember when I first read the script was great. It was riveting, but I was like, oh no, they're not going to like this, But part of it is that I'm not used to seeing myself from an outsider's perspective, at least not in this way. And that's where the persecution comes from. Wait, that's not fair. That's not the Brigham that I know. And I know him really well because I heard about him every day. No, hearing about him every day and trying to understand the man are two different things. And I think even historians and biographers, John Turner is one of them, can come away with still not, you can never quite know a person just from documents, but you can get close with clues. And we have some really good histories on Brigham Young. I think, though, what I would ask Latter-day Saints to do is imagine a prophet, a really powerful prophet that controls a whole region of land with thousands and thousands and thousands of people, like Brigham Young. But imagine it's not Brigham Young. Imagine he's a prophet of a religion you don't like. And now what does that do to the story? What does that do to the character? What does that do to him? Does he seem dangerous now? Because that's how people saw Brigham Young. He was running a dangerous, zealous sect of believers who had already shown they had a penchant for violence and for defending their right to exist. That was a threat to the government. It was a threat to the indigenous tribes that came here. Now, my ancestors who all lived under Brigham Young saw it differently, right? They were defending their families. This was a holy purpose for them. And so all of those perspectives are there. Now, I'll throw a bone to Latter-day Saints who were offended by the show. I do think that they could have shown more persecution for the Mormons to show how they got that violent. There's some hints at that, but again, it was not really interested in redeeming the Mormons, but I think that could have helped. I also think having more historically accurate depictions of a few of the character arcs might have worked and satiated that, but probably not, because at the end of the day, Brigham Young in this story is a villain. But again, I will say, when you say Brigham Young wasn't like that, I think you just don't know Utah War. I mean, I did this for Radio West, but I made a list of like 30 massacres, murders, and conflicts that Brigham Young and the Nauvoo Legion, just Brigham Young and the Nauvoo Legion, were involved in over a 20-year period. And they were a violent group. There were murders that happened. We talked about Porter Rockwell earlier. We talked about the Timpanogos massacre. There were other massacres that occurred under the hands of the Nauvoo Legion. These weren't pious pioneers. These were dangerous frontiersmen who were defending their territory by threat of death. And, you can keep your prophet version, but you also have to understand why people have their perspective.
This has been such a fascinating discussion, and I appreciate everybody's expertise on all of this to kind of see how this show has sparked so much interesting conversation about LDS history, about the West, about Native Americans, and certainly about Brigham Young. I'm really, really excited for all of you. Let me just say, are there any final things that we didn't get to that you wanted to make sure that we mention before we wrap up?
I just want to say one thing about Mormons enjoying film. I think that Mormons are a fascination, and there's going to be more Mormon representation in film. I really liked Heretics' representation of Mormonism. I still haven't gotten the representation of Mormons on the screen that I would really like to see. But I think that there's still some room there. But I do appreciate those who are able to separate the crafts of history and film. I think that that's essential in understanding the lens. It has been for me. I've had to learn the difference and the limitations of those different crafts and the goals. And so I would invite Latter-day Saints who feel really strong feelings to get a little bit more creative in their imagination about perspective when it comes to storytelling, and that will do a world of good in all areas, I think.
And I'll just quickly add, I think Latter-day Saints should be thrilled that they're still seen as a usable canvas on which creators, talented creators, will paint their stories of America, right? It shows that the faith remains relevant. It shows that America believes there's something in this marginalized religion that can tell us something about the core of America, about humanity, about history. And I think that's something good. And so it's something that needs to be engaged and wrestled with rather than dismissed.
A very optimistic take from both of you on this one. And but again, I think that both of you are right that that we as a people need to be a little bit more mature about how we're represented. Certainly we can engage that critically as well, but also to acknowledge that for whatever reason, for our good fortune or bad, Latter-day Saints are a staple right now in media representation and media depictions, and no one ever seems to get it right for some reason, and we're always, everything fails. I don't know for why we think everything fails, but for the most part, there are some really interesting and nuanced perspectives that I think that we can gain from a close analysis, a close study of all of this. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Ben. And thank you, Angelo, for your participation today. I'm really, really happy that we got all of you together. To our listeners, thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues. And don't forget to leave us a review or get in touch with any comments or questions. We hope that you'll tune in to future episodes of the podcast, so please subscribe and rate the show, and be sure to check out the whole range of shows in the Dialogue Podcast Network. Thanks.
Greetings, my name is Rebecca DeSchweinitz, and I'm thrilled to serve as a board member at the Dialogue Foundation and as one of the hosts of Dialogue Gospel Study. In each episode, which we record live the second and fourth Sunday of every month, we welcome esteemed speakers from a variety of backgrounds to share their insights and perspectives on the Come Follow Me lessons. Our aim is to spark meaningful conversations about the scriptures, to connect them to our personal experiences and to our understandings and explorations of the gospel. To stay in the loop with our upcoming lessons and this opportunity to engage with Mormon thought, culture, and belief, be sure to visit dialoguejournal.com and sign up for our newsletter. By doing so, you'll receive updates and timely links to join our live stream lessons. Additionally, you can catch up on our past guests and episodes by subscribing to Dialogue Journal on YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Dialogue Podcast Network.